Well, Paul, you've done a really good job of pacing these talks. I assume that I'm windy. We just had Earth, and I must be the wind. Dr. Asher was able to cover 90 years in 20 minutes. I'm going to attempt to cover 18 million years in my allotted time. But we have a very good time machine, so it should not be a big problem. I spent the last 6-7 years of my career at the USDA studying methane from cattle production systems. And so I'm going to incorporate some of that in this talk. The overarching, first of all, as we go through this, I want you to consider just a few things, because I'm not going to necessarily provide any answers. I'm going to kind of give you my observations, but I think you could probably draw your own also as a group of people educated in the human habitation on this place that we call the Great Plains. So what is the original language of the Great Plains? Can we identify an essential nature and how that is expressed in the Great Plains? Study what humans have done in the past, but there's also a role of humans today in the Great Plains. And we want to consider that as we go through this talk. And basically what that boils down to is this one question: what will the Great Plains be? Does the past inform the future? Please consider these things as we go through the talk. The overarching issue that we faced when we did our research was global warming and the climate change and climate disruption that follows from that. And over the 30 years or so that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has been putting out reports, they just put out the 6th report. This is from that report. They've changed, the science has changed from relatively immature science to one that's very well developed and mature. Now they are using words like indisputable, unequivocal, unprecedented to describe the changes in the climate system on the Earth. And those changes that are happening are by human agency, primarily through the burning of fossil fuels, production of greenhouse gases that go into the atmosphere and warm the planet. So this is kind of the umbrella under which we do our work, and will be part of your consideration. We're going to talk about methane. Methane is the second most important greenhouse gas after carbon dioxide, and you can see for the past 800,000 years, methane has varied, but it's been a fairly narrow band of variation between about 400 and 700 parts per billion in the atmosphere. But about the middle of the 19th century, right here, it began to skyrocket. Until now, we have methane concentration in the atmosphere that's approaching 1,900 parts per billion. Methane probably contributes about 30% or so of the energy forcing in the atmosphere. So it's a significant greenhouse gas. Look at the places where methane is produced in the United States. You can see the hot spots, and if you look real closely, you might start to detect some patterns here. For example, let's look at Texas. Anyone know what this area right here is? It's the Barnett Shale. This area right here, the Permian Basin. Those are areas where fossil fuels are produced and methane is released during their production. Just west of us, this area right here, what goes on right there? Any idea? That's a big concentration of feedlots. So we have some other areas here, swine production in Iowa. This is Duplin County in North Carolina, swine production there. This is the Marcellus Shale, so that's a fossil fuel production area. So this highlights the two main contributions to methane: animal agriculture and fossil fuel production. If we focus on agriculture, about 8 to 10% of the US inventory of greenhouse gases is produced by agriculture, and about 30% of that is in this category called enteric methane. Well, what is enteric methane? It's the methane that's produced by animals inside their bodies. And most of that comes from beef cattle, over 70% of that. And most of the enteric methane produced by beef cattle comes from grazing beef cattle. So altogether, our grazing beef cattle produce about 18% of the US methane inventory. This is a nice cartoon that illustrates how that process works. Cattle eat, graze grass, eat roughage, food that's high in complex carbohydrates like cellulose, hemicellulose, lignins. They have a host of bacteria and other microbiota that break down those complex hydrocarbons in simpler forms that the animal can use. But during that digestive process, methane is produced as a byproduct. And so the animal, a ruminant, will breathe, burp, eructate that methane out into the atmosphere. About 95% of it comes out of its mouth. Only about 5% here. So that's always my litmus test for someone who knows about methane. If they say it's caused by flatulence, they probably don't know what they're talking about. Now, this is the digestive system of a ruminant. The four-chambered stomachs with the rumen, basically a methane digester. There's another class of animals called hindgut fermenters. For example, a horse would be a hindgut fermenter. You are all hindgut fermenters, and you know how that works. So I won't go into that process. Now we're going to get in our time machine. We're going to go back, say 18 million years to the Miocene and the Great Plains. By the way, these are murals from just wonderful murals painted on walls of the Smithsonian. Aren't they delightful? Great Plains were a mosaic of woods and open grasslands, a savanna, and the assemblage of mammals were primarily browsers. By the Pliocene, the land had started to open up. There were considerably fewer browsers, and the proportion of grazers had increased. And then get in our time machine, we're going to go up to the late Pleistocene. The age of glaciers is ending, and the assemblage of mammals now is dominated by procedians like mammoth and mastodons, camels, horses, and which, by the way, are all hindgut fermenters. We have a few ruminants in this assemblage of animals. There's some ruminants right there. And then a new species shows up. in North America. And I'm preaching to the choir here, but aren't these the most beautiful things made by humans that you've seen? I think these are just incredible, these Clovis points. But this new species arrived, and that assemblage of ice age mammals greatly changed. They call it the great megafaunal, post-Pleistocene megafaunal extinction. And I'm sure there's people have opinions about that, but it undoubtedly was human mediated. To what degree, I think, is where the controversy lies. But it's with technology like this that humans were able to exploit the mammals that were living in that post-glacial age. And here are many of the sites. I imagine some of these sites we've learned about today, where humans were able to exploit that rich mammal fauna that existed on the Great Plains. So the mastodons were gone, the mammoths were gone, the camels were gone, horses were gone. And what was left was a group of mammals that were primarily not hindgut fermenters, but ruminants, animals like elk, pronghorn antelope, different species of deer, much smaller than the animals that had existed before that species crossed the Bering Land Bridge to North America. And probably first among those mammals was the American bison. It's interesting because at this very podium several years ago, Dan Flores spoke, and he had talked about bison as being a weed species. Now imagine all of these niches that have been occupied by those large hindgut fermenters suddenly opened up with their extinction. And what exploited those niches was the American bison, just like weeds in a tilled field. And they were able to spread and become the dominant large mammal on North American continent. So this got me thinking. There were bison here before there were cattle. Both produced methane. I wonder what the methane production produced by the cattle, bison were compared to the methane production of the cattle that we have now. Because this has some important implications, because in the face of climate change, there's this pressure to reduce methane. And because remember, the two sources of methane, fossil fuel production and animal agriculture is in the crosshairs of reducing methane. How much did we really change when we went from bison herd to cattle herd? So I set out to explore that question. To do that, we have to use models. Models are mathematical descriptions of whatever we're interested in studying. In this case, I used 4 different models. 2 of them are called YM models. YM models basically look at how much energy an animal takes in, and methane production is a fraction of that energy. We use research to determine what that fraction YM is. The other 2 models I use are called allometry models. Basically, what allometry models do is they scale methane with the body mass of an animal. Let me show you how that works. So you go through the literature, you take a range of studies with animals from tiny little guys like this all the way up to elephants. And you get their weight, and you get their methane emission, and you establish a relationship between and fit a curve to those data points. Now, the black here are ruminants. The blue are hindgut fermenters. And the first thing you notice is that for a given body mass, ruminant more methane than a hindgut fermenter. That's a hard and fast physiological fact. So we have to deal differently. We have different equations for hindgut fermenters than we do for the minutes. So I took these 4 models, but obviously we need to know a few more things. We need to know, we're going to look at these populations of wild ruminants. We need to know the body mass of those animals, and we need to know, we need to have some estimate of their population. So I did that with bison, elk, deer, pronghorn antelope, just by looking at the literature and finding the best values I could out of the literature. It turns out that a pretty decent estimate of bison populations pre-European settlement would be about 30 million. Now, some of the estimates have ranged from 10 million to as many as 100 million. 30 million seems to fall in a pretty reasonable range. Mean weight of a bison is about 500 kilograms. I looked at different studies that kept weights of bison. One in Kansa Prairie, one over here in Oklahoma. So I had estimates of weights and populations. The contemporary cattle, that's no problem. USDA keeps great statistics about those animals. So when I ran the 4 models, I'm reporting here the average of those 4 models. This is what we found. For all grazing cattle in the U.S., 4.2 teragrams per year of methane were produced. A teragram is about 1.1 million U.S. tons. When we look at just the grazing cattle on the Great Plains and the pre-European settlement bison herd, there really is no difference here. It's 30 million bison, 36.5 million grazing cattle on the Great Plains. Really no difference in methane production. So this tells me that we went from 30 million bison in the central grasslands to 36 million cattle, and we really didn't change the methane output of those herds. Wild ruminants came in quite. Of course, these are smaller animals, so you would expect them to produce less methane, and that's exactly what they did. 58 million only produced 0.6 teragrams per year. You know, there were a lot of different animals on the Great Plains, and I was really interested. First of all, how about up to 1 billion prairie dogs? Small hindgut fermenters. Well, there's a lot of them, but they didn't produce a lot of methane. Beaver, however, are a little different critter. They are hindgut fermenters, but they produce wetlands, and wetlands are prodigious producers of methane in many circumstances. So it's possible, even though there's a lot of variability, that beaver wetlands produced a significant amount of methane, both today and pre-settlement. So what do these all have in common? Well, they're all ways that humans have devised to acquire animal protein. We can't graze grass, so we hunt, herd, and corral these animals to make animal protein. So when I considered the essential nature of the Great Plains, what is their original language? I came up with this. Yours may be different. This is mine. Grasses grow, take in solar energy. Grazers eat the grasses, and we eat the grazers. That is the dance of ecological relationships that has happened here where we live now for millennia. So what will the Great Plains be? Well, you know what? There are so many different paths that we can follow. And which one of these we follow, who knows? It may not even be our choice. The emphasis may be dictated for us. We don't know. But regardless of that path, we do have a challenge. As we attempt to mitigate the effects of climate change and that pressure on reducing methane becomes greater and greater and greater, we're going to have to balance that need with this essential relationship of what the Great Plains are. And that will be a challenge that we'll have to face, I believe, strongly in the coming years.